Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in conversation with Prof. Jonathan Jansen. It's good to have you all on the platform, and thanks, Prof, for joining us this afternoon. It is such an honor to have the opportunity to engage with you. You're one of the thought leaders in education and a critical voice in democracy and the development of human capital. Prof, I stood in your shadows a few times, taking in your lived experience and sound advice, and often the undertone of caution came through. And I'm very wary of that because you're a wise owl. My favorite book is the book you wrote on your mom, An Ode to Your Mom, Song of Sarah, Lessons from My Mother. This resonates with me deeply because it also speaks to my upbringing and my culture, and I often just go back to that book and smile when I read it. Thank you for being so honest and authentic in sharing that experience. Prof, you've got an illustrious CV, and I'm not going to go into that. I think people can Google you. But I am going to say that nothing comes close to your ability to put people at ease in your company. So with all the accolades, you are a people's person with high levels of humility and a huge inspiration to us. So I thank you again, and I'm just going to hand over to you. So Prof's going to do a presentation for us, and you're most welcome to join us in the chat line, make your comments and ask your questions. And after the presentation, we'll link up directly with Prof. Jansen. So thank you.
Greetings, everybody. It is a great privilege for me to eventually speak with you in the broader school community. And I want to address a question that I'm sure is on your mind during these very, very difficult times. And the question is, in South Africa, are there grounds for hope? Are there grounds for hope? Things are really bad. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world, especially among youth. We are struggling at the moment with the supply of electricity in our country. We have the discovery of a very dangerous or potentially dangerous variant on the virus, the coronavirus, called Omicron. We have been banned and unbanned in 1 week from traveling abroad. And so whether it is the pandemic or the electricity supply or unemployment or corruption in government, we're in a bad state. And I just wish to tell you, I'm a realist in that regard. In other words, I look reality in the face, and then as a scholar, as a scientist, I make a judgment about what it is that we know, how well we know it, and what we can do about it. So I'm not coming to you with a utopian view of the world or of South Africa. I'm not coming to you with a false sense of hope. I'm coming to you as a realist. And as I said, things are quite bad. When I first prepared this talk, the first version of this talk, it was very much with the July riots, those 8 days in July, as Juanita Hunter and her colleagues call it in a new book, which, by the way, I suggest you read. But if you look at the data from there, I mean, 3,400 people were arrested, more than 340 died as a result of those riots. And we still, those shocks are still reverberating across the country, and so on and so forth. I want to suggest, however, that how you look at the world will determine what you see in the world. In other words, as a social scientist, I was trained to understand that that the data doesn't speak for itself. The data is interpreted. So too, in the everyday world, how you see will determine whether there is hope or a sense of hope for the future. So how do I think about this grim reality in which we are all, to some extent, enmeshed. And the first thing that I do when I think about trouble is I think historically. In other words, I ask the question, have we been here before? Not with the specific events, but has our country in history faced situations in which the everyday person had a feeling of existential crisis, a feeling of, oh my word, this might be the end, and so on. And the answer is yes. We've been in these kinds of cataclysmic situations more often than we think. And I want to, for example, take you back over 100 years to the Boer War. It is now in history books called the South African War, and more and more researchers are starting to talk not about the way we used to in the past, about the Boers, as they were called at the time, versus the Brits, but also about blacks who fought in the war on each side of that particular entanglement. Now, at that time, there was certainly a sense in the general population of the end of a potentially devastating war that could, in that period, 1899 to 1902, basically mean the end of South Africa. And guess what happened? In 1910, we formed Union. And yes, they didn't realize there were black people in the Union, but they formed a union, and there was a peace brokered between the Boers and the Brits. And even though the Brits technically won the war, as we now know, there was a settlement that created, in fact, what today we call South Africa. And a terrible, terrible end was averted at that time, and the Boer War finished, etc. Then, for my generation and yours, many of you, there was apartheid. And I remember very clearly in the late 1980s that many of us as black South Africans thought that the Boers, as the term by then was used in a derogatory way, would not give up their privilege and their power without basically doing great harm to the country. And for those of you who didn't live at the time, I need to tell you, the country could have gone either way. There was the real possibility of that P.W. Botha era thinking of saying, you know what, we're not giving up all of the stuff that we have, and of black people, and particularly those in the struggle, sort of saying we won't take anything less than complete freedom, our land back and all of that, and so on. And then, miraculously, as we now know, Nelson Mandela walks out of prison, the liberation movements are unbanned, and F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela and others sit around a table and they work out a deal that in fact gave us not an ANC government, but a government of national unity initially, in which former enemies, co-governed at least for a short period of time. As in the case of the Boer War, a horrible ending or tragic ending was averted. And again, around that time, you might even, I'm just going to use one more example, you might recall the assassination of a hero in the liberation movement, a man called Chris Hani. And this was on the eve of the negotiations for a free South Africa, a democratic South Africa. And once again, certainly I thought this could completely derail, which was the goal. The goal of the right-wingers was to derail these democratic negotiations so that we could have in perpetuity in their crooked minds a white state that rules over black people, regardless of the reality of a broader post-colonial world. As you know, when Nelson Mandela first spoke at that time, under great, great, great pressure, he pointed out to the tragedy of the death of a hero, a black hero, but he also pointed in that amazing speech to the white Afrikaans woman who actually pointed out these assassins, and in a way that led to the arrest, as you now know, of the Polish immigrant and, of course, the Derby, the Australian immigrant. My point simply is we have constantly faced down tragedy. And I believe that as hard as it is now, history is on our side. I think we will get out of this mess one way or the other. The metro elections made it very clear that unlike many African countries, we are a country in which people are gradually realizing that they have the power to change who governs, even if it is only for now in the municipal elections. They would not have the corruption, the levels of corruption that we have. And I do believe in 2024 there is a very good chance that we could see a peaceful, not a easy, that I can assure you, but a peaceful transition of power to another kind of government. We've been here before. We will get out of this mess if you put on your historical goggles and took another look at how we got here. Number two, I try to think comparatively. In other words, I look at what happens elsewhere in the world and whether there are lessons to be learned for South Africa. Now, I spent a good time of my life as a student and then subsequently as a scholar in the United States. I think I know the country fairly well. And I can tell you now, I did not expect the January 6th insurrection when these bunch of white supremacist hoodlums, basically invaded the Capitol building, their sort of state house, if you will, in Washington, D.C. 5 people died, 130 police were injured, 4 committed suicide within the first 7 months. It was unbelievable. This was, in America, in effect, a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat to overturn the results of the democratic elections that had gotten rid of Donald Trump and put in place Joseph Biden as president. I honestly thought that could be a turning point. So if you think comparatively, other countries also have their crap, okay, but it doesn't mean the end of the world, even if at that moment you think that Chicken Licken might have been right and this guy would fall on top of us. Let's take another country that boasts a long history of democratic institutions, and that is the United Kingdom. Now, the United Kingdom, from the 6th to the 11th of August in 2011, had the kind of riots we saw in Phoenix, in KwaZulu-Natal, and in parts of Gauteng. And in that particular case, thousands of people rioted. There was arson all over the place. The police made 3,000 arrests as this orgy of violence spread across the UK. 3,043 of those arrests were criminal arrests. There was damage of £200 million to property, and so on and so forth. This was horrible. This was horrific. And at the time, people like Theresa May, before she became Prime Minister, was quoted as saying this could be the end of democracy in the UK. Well, it wasn't the end, and the UK rebounded, and so on and so forth. You know what is interesting? When I talk to friends of mine who live in the UK, both South Africans who are expats as well as English friends, none of them really remember very clearly what happened from the 6th to the 11th of August. And therein lies another tale, another danger, in that we sometimes forget, about these tragedies and just go on living without thinking what does it mean and how can we prevent recurrence. In any event, my point simply is when you think comparatively, we're not alone in having to, it feels like it sometimes, but we're not alone in having to deal with these horrendous orgies of violence that sometimes is the lot not only of poor countries but also of wealthy nations. And they come out of it, and I believe we too, if you think comparatively, would come out of that. The other thing that I tend to do when there's a crisis of this kind, like we saw in KZN and Gauteng in July, is I tend to think demographically. So when you read the media, you get the sense that the whole country is up in flames. It wasn't the whole country. It was actually just 2 provinces, and they're not even the whole province of Gauteng, and certainly not the whole of KZN. And so I'm often reminded when I read in the media in 2015-16, when we had those historic student protests around fees must fall and roads must fall, that very often when I read the media, and I was a sitting vice-chancellor at the time, when you read the media, you thought, oh, all the students, all 2 million students in post-school education were sort of rioting on the streets and on the campuses. Actually, it wasn't. It was a very small group of students. So I always sort of ask myself when there's a crisis, who is really revolting here? Whether the cause is just or not, who is revolting? Does this really represent all of our people? Or, in the case of universities, all of our students? And you will find in both cases, it's a very small proportion of people causing the trouble. But the majority of South Africans, I can tell you now, are not part of that kind of violence. The next point is I also tend to think institutionally. In other words, the chances of a country falling or collapsing under the weight of violent protests, for example, depends very much on the strength of its institutions. And here's the good news. The good news is that South Africa has very strong institutions. Think of our courts, for example. Our courts are not like, when people say to me, we're going the road of Zimbabwe, I say, you're obviously not thinking. We're not going to go the road of Zimbabwe. Because Zimbabwe's courts were captured by, Mugabe and his, criminal elements, and they destroyed the country. We have courts that could send a popular former president to prison. Don't forget that. And if you ever want to read a very supreme piece of judicial reasoning, read the text of Judge Sisi Kampepe's ruling about why it was necessary to send Zuma to prison. Whether he stayed there for 1 day or 100 days is not the important thing, is he could be convicted and sent to prison. And the reason she said this is important is if we don't do it to powerful people, the next time around, they won't believe in the courts as an independent arbiter of justice, and so on. We have very strong institutions, in this case, the courts. Think of the banks in South Africa. You might recall a few years ago, there was this global financial crisis. What happened in the global financial crisis? It's quite simple. The world's premier financial institutions collapsed, particularly in the rich countries. And again, I go to Europe and I go to the United States. What happened in South Africa? Very, very little of that kind of reverberation into our own country, because our banks were conservative. Our banks were well positioned to withstand the worst effects of the global financial crisis. We have strong courts as institutions. We have strong banks as institutions. We have strong universities. People often forget that regularly there's a bunch of South African universities that appear among the top 200 in the world. Now, I need to tell you, there's a lot of universities in the world. There are thousands of universities in the world. And the reason, by the way, that we have the capacity, the scientific capacity for surveillance when it comes to, mutations in the virus our viruses is because we have top scientists and so on. Yeah, some of our universities are broken. Yeah, some of them should probably be closed down. But the truth is, for scientific capacity, we're unrivaled on the African continent and unrivaled, by the way, in much of the developing world. Why? Because our universities as institutions are very strong. It gives us the Shabir Mahdis, the Slim Karims, the Glenda Grays, the Tuli de Oliveras, who's now, very popular, and many others. And we should be grateful for that. We have very strong institutions in this case. Our schools. I often write about the 80% of our schools that are not working, and that is my life's commitment to make sure that all our schools work, that, my child is not safe until everybody's child is safe, and I'll continue to do that. But just park that for a moment, just for a moment. And then you realize we have some of the top schools. People come here from the elite universities in other parts of the world to recruit our top high school students. You know that, I'm sure, and so on. So thankfully, with all the nonsense going on, with all the corruption, with all the violence, we still have very strong schools as institutions. And then I would be remiss if I did not mention that we also have very strong media houses. The media as an institution is very strong in South Africa. Bear this in mind. There is no way former President Zuma would have gone to prison if it wasn't for the consistent high-level investigative reporting that we had from the media. This is something we must never underestimate. And for all our government's faults, it has not clamped down on the media. It's unhappy about the media. It tried one or two stunts to try and blame the media for the ANC's losses in the municipalities and so on. So that's total nonsense. They won't get away with it. Why? Because our institutions are strong. And while that is in place, those institutions, we are in a good space. Doesn't mean there won't be violence. It doesn't mean there won't be criminality, but it does mean that we can fight back through the power of our institutions. And finally, I also tend to think humanistically. I tend to think in terms of the human element within all of us. When Phoenix happened, we all concentrated, understandably, on the crisis, on the violence, on the racism, on the unbelievable looting, the arson, and so on. That caught our minds. But we didn't give the same attention to the gift of the givers. We didn't give the same attention to the trucks from the Free State, one of them commandeered by my former secretary, Ilse Leroux, from Bloemfontein, taking towards Durban food and water and bandages and hope. This is an amazing country. Because of my job, working with schools and also universities, I often go into the 9 provinces. I can tell you this without any fear of contradiction, that the number of good people in this country, black and white, far outweigh the number of crooks and criminals and violent people in our country. That is a fact. I often speak about the moral underground, title of a book I once read, the millions of South Africans who, without fanfare, without recognition, feed the hungry, take care of children when their domestic mothers go to work, who pay for the children of the domestic to go to the same school as their own child, who make huge sacrifices so that we can be here today, to the nurses in the front line, some of whom fell ill and died. We've got a book coming out on nurses, which I'm happy to be a co-author of. The teachers who, in this pandemic, made huge sacrifices, especially for the children of the poor. You know what? My faith doesn't lie in politicians. My faith lies in our people. And that is why there are grounds for hope. God bless you, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Prof. That was such an insightful presentation and a chat on are there grounds for hope. And I think being in a school, I see it every day because hope lies in our students and in the way we engage with them. Also in your book, Learning Lessons, I'm enjoying this at the moment. I'm reading it over and over. You speak about a colleague of yours or a friend, Molly Banks, who made a film testing hope in one of the Cape Town schools in Yanga that you visited. And one of the students that was featured in the film was stabbed. And when you saw the movie, you realized that you actually visited the school, and shortly after that, one of the examiners of history called you up and said, there's a brilliant student who obtained 100% in history, and you go, so from which school? And you said and she said the Oscar Mapta High School. And you asked for his name, and you called him up, and when you spoke to Sinokolo, you said, so, and this is, I'm going to just read what you're saying. What are you planning to do with your life? And he replied, well, Prof, I'm on my way to Cape Town to get a license to become a bus driver for Golden Arrow. And you said, okay, but would you not rather study further? And he said, I applied to UCT, but was not accepted. And then you asked, would you consider, at the time you were at the University of the Free State, would you consider coming here? And you said to him, get on a bus and I'll meet you at the bus stop in Bloemfontein. That's such a good example, or perfect example of altruism and reaching out and building a sense of hope. I guess that story ended, it was the good end to that story, breaking the cycle of poverty. What would you say to us in schools? How can we train that muscle of looking out for the underdog and helping where we can without reservation?
Yeah, and thank you very much. And you know, the beautiful story about Sinokolo is that he gets the Mandela Rhodes scholarship. He becomes a teacher of history and English. And he now works in schools with a passion, you know, I think in Easterus in Pretoria, with a passion that I can't match. And so you have this multiplier effect. You think it was about one student, but he now teaches every year 90 students, year after year after year, who then go on, hopefully, at least some of them, to also become, you know, passionate professionals in whatever field they might find themselves. And I think I always say, you know, I've got a friend, Denzel Smith, you know, he's a very simple guy who grew up in the flats close to where I live. And he's got this beautiful expression, just start where you are, or start with where you are. So instead of looking for a big project somewhere, instead of all wanting to work for Gift of the Givers, ask yourself, in your home, for example, there is a domestic whose child is as talented as anybody else's child, but will never get to a really good school with a really good, you know, set of outcomes, unless you are prepared, if you can, to sponsor that student financially. Think of this young boy Jordan who was at St. John's, you know, who fed. This kid was 13 years old when I invited him to be a graduation speaker in the Free State. And he had, you know, every week he fed thousands of families in Alexandria, close to where he lived. So my thing is always sort of ask yourself, what gifts do you have? What professional experiences do you have? What opportunities can you bridge others into? And what can you as a school do to broaden the opportunity? You know, I said to Bishop's Old Boys the other day, you know, I said, you know, you're probably one of the wealthiest schools on the planet. You know, it won't hurt you with all of the privileges that you have to say every year we're going to take 20 more talented students. So instead of having the parents give all that money for a state-of-the-art, you know, water or stadium or whatever the case might be, you can still do that. But what have you said? You know, we're going to take 10 of us who happen to be in dysfunctional schools. And I've got no problem with that. The rest of us are working to fix those schools. But in the meantime, every year there are young people who will never see a good matric pass simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time in history and say we're going to take the most talented. I have no problem with that. I work in universities. I want the most talented students, black and white, to work with me. And then I give them, 18 hours a day of my time. What can you as a school do and pursue it? Don't take on 20 projects, take on one or two, and then make sure that others can also enjoy the privilege. There's nothing wrong with being privileged. It's just the way things shook out historically. But what you do with it is the crucial thing.
What you're saying is so true, Prof. And often the schools in the higher socioeconomic echelons are looked to for help. And you're saying, as hard as it is, history is on our side. And I think from history we've learned, and through some of the stories shared by you, that there's lots of opportunities that we can make a difference. But we are blamed often for our history, and in poor schools and in rich schools, and schools are branded in terms of their history. How do we use the history in our schools as a catalyst of hope?
As a catalyst
of hope.
Of hope. So I think the first thing to do is to really take a good look at that history, And every school has a history. When you look at a study we did in schools here along the main road in Cape Town, which is some of the wealthiest schools on the continent, and they have histories that are both histories that are partisan, because they were started most of all as colonial schools, as extension of empire, etc. But they also became, over the years, especially in the late 1980s onwards, earlier for the Catholic schools, by the way, and some of the Anglican schools, they opened up their doors, And so tell the history. No history is good enough if it only tells the stories of light. It also has to tell the stories of the shadows. And all of us, whether it's family history or school history or church history, there are light moments of great, illumination, but also things we are ashamed of. Tell the whole story. There's a horrible thing happening in the United States right now where they are banning books left, right, and center, simply because the books talk about the history of slavery. Now, what must you talk about? Must you just imagine that everybody always was equal? That is, of course, a lie, and the children know it. So tell the stories of hope, tell the stories of light, tell the stories of change, tell the stories of transformation, tell the story of Sinokolo, but also tell the story of the crappy school he went to. So I think we need to bring nuance, complexity, and truthfulness into our stories, because those stories can uplift. And by the way, when you're honest about your past, people believe you more easily. But schools that simply confuse marketing with history are not going to get very, very far, because young people can see through our pretense, I mean, as I said, all institutions are like that. I'm now doing a study of the history of my family. And there are some uncles I really would like to erase from history. But they were.
We all have those, Prof.
We all have those. But without them, there is no story, and no authentic story anyway. But as I said, it's a two-edged sword. Be honest about that past, but also look for the moments of hope, the moments of inspiration, the moments of change.
Prof, I like what you say when you say we forget without thinking what it means. We forget without thinking what the history means, and lessons from our students. If we look at the 76 Soweto uprising, and we look at the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising, and the strong correlation between the two young people using their voice, advocating for themselves, how do we evolve and make our institutions relevant for these students?
Yeah, well, first of all, for the students who are still hurting, there's a truthfulness once again that one has to bring to the table. I just wrote a piece on the University of the Western Cape on the occasion of the death of the Durant, who at the time, in a much less,
visible way or obvious way was one of the few white Afrikaans-speaking professors who took the side of the oppressed, And I was talking about that as the moment of great light and a moment to celebrate, and so on. And that encourages students. Even then, as a student myself, undergraduate student, I didn't, there was a lot of resentment against white people. I have to be honest about that. At the time, there was a lot of, anger. And then you saw this guy and you said, well, for every terrible racist you encountered on campus, there was a Beyers Naudé, there was a Jaap Durant, there was, a progressive white person. That story is encouraging. Then for the students of today, it's also important not to allow them. When I saw the anger in the decolonization moment in 2015-17, a lot of that I understood, of course. But what they were telling, many of the more radical students, is they were telling one-sided stories. They weren't telling stories of whites who were in the struggle. They weren't talking stories about. So again, as I said, to encourage the present generation, you have to talk about the bad things, but you also have to talk about the people who, against the grain of their own communities, their own cultures, decided to stand up outside history. And that gives people enormous hope. And so in the presentation that I made, I could focus on the fact that there were really bad things happening in the South African war, and all of us would walk away depressed without realizing it was also a turning point, in the fight against empire. And so, nuance, complexity, truthfulness, that's my message in relation to students then and now.
I will leave you with that, Prof. One of you, in your book, Learning Lessons, you say your greatest strength is tenacity. How do you get it right to stay so resilient, and how do you get it right to remain so hopeful? I think you're faced with a lot of sadness and hardships in your journey, visiting schools and engaging with people, and you keep on, creating spaces where people feel that they have a voice, and it can be perceived as miracle moments, small miracle moments in our country, and you do it against all the critics and the politicians that come to you and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. How do you remain so tenacious?
Well, one of the things I really appreciate about my mother, Sarah, which you would have read about in the book, one of the things I really appreciated about her is teaching me from a very young age that if what you stand for is something you really believe in, you can sleep at night. Yes. But if you don't, if you sort of waver in the winds, of political opportunism and so on and so forth, how do you sleep at night? So for me, students often ask me, how do you take this constant barrage of criticism from, left and right and also from government? I do two things. First of all, I don't listen to it very much. So I don't go down the comments on something I posted on Twitter, because you'd have to pay your shrink a lot of money to watch it. So I don't engage I don't sit down and sort of say, oh my goodness, people are saying that. I say, I believe it is right to say that the matric results, for example, is a farce. Yes. Period. I don't care what you say about that. On the other hand, it is also important because sometimes often I get it wrong. And so I also listen to voices that say, and I have friends now who would say to me, listen, we agree with you on this, this, and this, but you need to take another look at that.
Your critical friends.
Absolutely. These are your real friends, by the way, who can tell you in a very nice way where you get it wrong. And so being open to that is very important to me. Maybe as a friend of mine said, actually, at UCT is told a friend, that maybe my skin is too thick.
Prof, and then coming back to Sinatolo's, your engagement with Sinatolo, the last question you asked him, so tell me, who was your history teacher? And he said it was a Zimbabwean. And, we struggle with xenophobia in our country. And you speak about the human element within all of us. the humanism. How do we cultivate empathy in our students to understand what humanity means and cultivate humanism?
Yeah, I take a long view as a parent of two adult children now, which I'm very blessed with. And my wife is really to be honored for this, is that from the moment they were born, when they opened their eyes, they saw in our home Christian and Muslim and Jewish people. They saw in our home straight people and gay people. They saw in our home Zimbabweans, Congolese, Latin Americans, and so on and so forth. In other words, their normative world was not one in which the people, all the Cape Flats spoke, Kombees Afrikaans and so on and so forth. It was that, but much more. And so I always say to parents when I do parent workshops, I can predict whether your child is going to have problems with race and religion based on who comes to the braai at your home. I can predict trouble. And trust me, I worked at the Free State and in Pretoria, Tikkies. I can predict trouble. And so don't underestimate, long before a child gets to school, they already have an attitude, long before grade 1, about race, about hair, about skin, about foreign and local, and so on and so forth, because they listen to adult conversations. They listen to comments when the father is watching the TV and what he says about the border and that kind of thing. So we put too much pressure, I think, sometimes on the school to fix everything.
Yes.
When we don't realize kids are very often heavily influenced already by what they, and by the time they come to university, as I often say to my students at university, why did you come to university? You've got all the answers already. Why are you wasting my time? You believe you're right about everything. And then of course there's the role of the school, which, in all our schools, whether you're privileged or not, we often have to make up for what went wrong in the home, in the church, in the mosque, in the rugby club, whatever the case might be. And then we have a very solemn responsibility, not to indoctrinate them, but to keep them in a space in which they believe they could be wrong, in which other alternatives are also put on the table, in which thinking through problems becomes what my friend John Samuel calls a habit. You've got to teach them. This is probably the most important thing that a school does. Forget science and math and geography, as much as I love science and math. One of the most important duties in the course of teaching those subjects is to teach children the habits of democracy. Because if you don't, they don't know how to think their way out of the problem, and their default reaction, especially for boys, is to fight.
Prof, I thank you for your time. Thank you for your inspiration. It's always a privilege to stand in your shadow, and I trust that everybody who's joined us today will be taking something away and will be practicing in their lives and creating hope around them and be an inspiration and a beacon of hope. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate your inspiration and your time. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.